My name is Sophia Winters, I'm 28, and 3 months ago I discovered that everything I believed about my family was a carefully constructed lie. The golden child they chose over me? The sister who could do no wrong? She wasn't even their biological daughter. But here's the twist that'll make your jaw drop. When I finally exposed the truth that shattered our family forever, the person who screamed the loudest wasn't my parents. It was her. Before we dive into this family revenge story that'll leave you questioning everything about loyalty and blood, tell me where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like the forgotten child, and don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you won't want to miss how this saga of family betrayal ends. Ready to see how karma finally caught up? Let's go. Growing up, I was always the shadow in my own home. While my younger sister Violet got piano lessons, dance classes, and endless praise for her achievements, I was expected to be grateful for hand-me-downs and silence. My parents, Margaret and Richard Winters, had always made it crystal clear who their favorite was. Violet was their precious miracle baby, born when they thought they couldn't have more children after struggling with infertility for years after having me. I learned to accept my role as the overlooked daughter early. When Violet won spelling bees, the refrigerator showcased her certificates. When I made honor roll consistently, it barely earned a "that's nice, honey." When she needed emergency money for college textbooks, Dad wired it immediately. When I needed help with my student loans, I got a lecture about financial responsibility. The pattern continued into adulthood. Violet's engagement party? They flew across the country and paid for the whole celebration. My college graduation? They sent a card. Her wedding? They took out a second mortgage to give her the perfect day. My wedding? They complained about taking time off work to attend. 3 months ago, everything changed during what started as a routine visit to help Dad clean out the attic. Mom was in the hospital recovering from a minor surgery, and Dad needed help sorting through decades of accumulated memories. I thought I was being the dutiful daughter, finally getting some one-on-one time with my father. That's when I found the box. Hidden behind Christmas decorations and old photo albums, I discovered a manila envelope with Violet, confidential, written in Mom's careful handwriting. Something about the way it was hidden, separate from everything else, made my curiosity spike. I knew I shouldn't look, but after years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, I couldn't resist. Inside were documents that made my hands shake. Adoption papers dated 6 months after Violet's supposed birth. Medical records showing Mom's hysterectomy had happened 2 years before Violet came into our lives. Birth certificates, both the original and the amended version. The original showed different parents entirely. But the most devastating discovery was the correspondence with the adoption agency. Letter after letter detailing how desperately my parents wanted a second child, how they'd specifically requested a baby girl to be a companion for their existing daughter. How they'd paid extra fees for a private, closed adoption to ensure the biological family could never interfere. They'd chosen Violet. Literally picked her out like she was a prize, while I was just the child they were stuck with. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. Not because Violet was adopted, that didn't change who she was as a person. But because of the elaborate lie they'd constructed around her origin story, the way they'd rewritten history to make her seem like their miraculous natural child while treating me like I was the unwanted accident. As I sat in that dusty attic, pieces of my childhood suddenly made horrible sense. The way they'd always seemed to connect with Violet effortlessly while struggling to relate to me. How they'd bent over backwards to give her every opportunity while expecting me to be grateful for the basics. The countless times they'd told people about their miracle baby born after years of trying, never mentioning that those years of trying had happened after my birth, not before. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, my heart pounding as I heard Dad moving around downstairs. The evidence was damning, but what made it worse was realizing this wasn't just about Violet being adopted. This was about 28 years of deliberate deception, of making me feel like I wasn't enough while elevating a child they'd specifically chosen to love more than me. When I came downstairs, Dad was making coffee, humming contentedly. "Find anything interesting up there, sweetheart?" he asked, using the casual endearment that had always felt hollow compared to how he spoke to Violet. I forced a smile. Just the usual old junk. Nothing worth keeping. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I had leverage. I had proof that the perfect family narrative they'd built was a house of cards. And after decades of being treated like the consolation prize, I was finally ready to decide what to do with that power. The question was, did I want justice, revenge, or something else entirely? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my phone beside me with those damning photos, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just at the lie itself, but at how expertly they'd managed it for nearly 3 decades. I started making lists, the way I always did when overwhelmed. First, I wrote down every memory that now made sense in this new context. The way Dad's eyes lit up differently when Violet walked into a room. How Mom always seemed to have endless patience for Violet's dramatics, but grew irritated quickly with my quieter needs. The family photos where I was somehow always positioned slightly outside the intimate triangle they formed. Then I listed every sacrifice I'd made over the years that had gone unnoticed. The times I'd canceled plans to help with family emergencies, while Violet was mysteriously never available. The career opportunities I'd passed up to stay close to home, thinking it would finally earn their approval. The relationships I'd ended because my parents made it clear my boyfriends weren't quite good enough, while Violet's string of questionable partners were welcomed with open arms. By morning, I had a plan. Not a revenge fantasy born of hurt feelings, but a calculated strategy to expose the truth in a way that would force them to confront their decades of preferential treatment. I started with research. Over the next 2 weeks, I dove deep into adoption laws, inheritance rights, and family legal precedents. I discovered that Violet's adoption had never been fully disclosed to extended family, meaning aunts, uncles, and grandparents had unknowingly participated in the deception. I also found that there were financial implications they'd never considered: insurance policies, will provisions, and family trust documents that were all based on the false premise that Violet was their biological child. The beauty of my plan wasn't in destroying Violet. She was as much a victim of this deception as I was. The real target was my parents' carefully constructed narrative and their assumption that they could continue manipulating the truth without consequences. I began documenting everything with methodical precision. Every phone call where they gushed about Violet's latest achievement while barely acknowledging my news. Every family gathering where I was expected to help in the kitchen while Violet was entertained in the living room. Every holiday where my gifts were clearly afterthoughts while hers were carefully chosen and expensive. But I also started building alliances. I reached out to my Aunt Carol, Mom's sister, who had always seemed slightly uncomfortable with how differently my parents treated Violet and me. Without revealing what I knew, I started asking careful questions about family history, about Violet's birth, about whether she remembered visiting Mom in the hospital during that time. Carol's responses confirmed my suspicions. She remembered the period differently than the official family story. She recalled Mom being secretive and evasive during those months, canceling visits and making excuses. She'd always found it strange that Mom had been so private about the pregnancy and birth, especially since she'd been so open about wanting another child. I also connected with my cousin Jake, Carol's son, who worked in legal research. Again, without revealing specifics, I started learning about adoption disclosure laws and what rights biological versus adopted children had in inheritance situations. The information was enlightening and disturbing in equal measure. Meanwhile, I began changing my own behavior patterns. Instead of jumping to help every time my parents called with a crisis, I started setting boundaries. When they expected me to drive across town to help with yard work while Violet was conveniently busy with wedding planning, I politely declined and suggested they hire help or ask their precious daughter to reschedule her nail appointment. The shift was subtle but noticeable. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't bending over backward to earn approval I was never going to receive anyway. Instead, I was observing them with the cold clarity that comes from finally understanding the game you've been losing your whole life. I also started keeping a detailed journal of their interactions with both Violet and me. The evidence was staggering when compiled systematically. In a single month, they called Violet 47 times and me 9 times. They offered her unsolicited help with her mortgage payment while lecturing me about financial independence when I mentioned considering a career change. They spent an entire dinner discussing Violet's vacation plans while changing the subject when I tried to share news about a promotion at work. The pattern was so consistent it was almost comical, except for the fact that it had shaped my entire sense of self-worth for nearly 3 decades. As I gathered evidence and built my case, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Not the destructive kind that comes from wanting to hurt people, but the quiet confidence that comes from finally understanding a situation completely and having the tools to address it effectively. I wasn't ready to play my hand yet, but I was methodically preparing for the moment when I would. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be an emotional outburst or a desperate plea for attention. It would be a carefully orchestrated revelation that would force everyone involved to confront the truth they'd been avoiding for decades. The only question left was timing. I needed the perfect moment, the right audience, and the maximum impact. Because after 28 years of being the afterthought, I was finally ready to become impossible to ignore. As spring turned to summer, my careful documentation strategy began revealing patterns even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. It wasn't just that my parents preferred Violet, they'd systematically rewritten family history to support their deception, involving everyone from grandparents to family friends in maintaining the elaborate fiction of Violet's origin story. The breaking point came during 4th of July weekend. My parents had planned their annual backyard barbecue, the kind of family gathering where everyone was expected to play their designated roles perfectly. I arrived early to help set up, as always, while Violet would make her grand entrance later with her fiancé Marcus, timing her arrival perfectly to maximize attention. I was arranging chairs when I overheard Mom on the phone with her sister Ruth, Aunt Carol's twin. "Oh, Ruth, you should see how radiant Violet looks planning this wedding. She's just like I was at her age. Remember how excited I was when I was pregnant with her? That natural glow is definitely genetic." The casual lie, delivered so smoothly after decades of practice, made my stomach turn. But it also gave me an idea. If Mom was comfortable lying to family members about easily verifiable facts, what else had she twisted over the years? I started listening more carefully to family conversations, taking mental notes of inconsistencies. During dinner, when Great-Uncle Frank mentioned how much Violet resembled Dad around the eyes, Mom jumped in with a story about how all the women in her family had that same eye shape. When Cousin Jennifer commented on Violet's musical talent, Dad launched into a detailed explanation of the family's artistic genetics, tracing musical ability through 3 generations. Every lie was delivered with such confidence, such practiced ease, that I realized this wasn't just about hiding an adoption. This was about 2 people who had become so invested in their fabricated narrative that they'd lost sight of reality entirely. That evening, after most guests had left and Violet had departed with Marcus for a romantic dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Aunt Carol while my parents watched television in the living room. She was helping me load the dishwasher when she said something that stopped me cold. "You know, Sophia, I've always admired how well you handled being the older sister. It couldn't have been easy when Violet came along so suddenly." I looked up from the plates I was rinsing. "Suddenly?" Carol paused, glancing toward the living room where we could hear Dad's laughter at some TV show. "Well, you know what I mean. Your mom had been so devastated about the fertility issues, and then boom, pregnant at 42 after all those years. It was quite a surprise for everyone." This was new information. According to family lore, my parents had been trying for a second child since I was 2 years old. But Carol was suggesting the timeline was different, that there had been fertility issues I'd never heard about. "Can you remind me exactly how old I was when Mom got pregnant with Violet?" I asked carefully. Carol tilted her head, thinking. "Oh, let's see. You must have been about 6 or 7. Because I remember your mom calling me in tears when the doctor told her she'd never have another baby naturally. You were in first grade because she was worried about how to tell you that you'd always be an only child. And then, maybe a year later, she called with the news about Violet. We were all shocked. The timeline didn't match. According to the official story, my parents had been trying for another child since I was 2. But Carol was describing fertility issues that weren't discovered until I was 6, followed by a miraculous pregnancy when I was 7 or 8. Violet was supposedly born when I was 9, which meant there was at least a year gap that didn't add up. I filed this information away and continued the conversation naturally, but my mind was racing. If Carol's memory was accurate, it meant my parents had been lying about the timeline for so long that even they might have started believing their own fiction. After Carol left, I stayed behind to finish cleaning up, using the time to casually probe my parents about family history. I asked Mom about her pregnancies, about how she felt when the doctor first told her she was expecting again after all those years of trying. Her responses were vague and rehearsed, full of generalities that could apply to anyone's pregnancy experience. When I asked specific questions, what hospital, which doctor, whether she had morning sickness, she deflected or changed the subject. Dad was even worse, offering enthusiastic but non-specific memories that sounded more like stories he'd heard than experiences he'd lived. By the end of the evening, I was convinced that not only was Violet adopted, but my parents had been practicing their deception so long that they'd created an alternate reality where they were the starring characters in a heartwarming story about perseverance and miracle babies. The next week, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I called Aunt Carol and asked if we could meet for coffee. It was time to test the waters with someone who might become an ally. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, and after some initial small talk, I took a deep breath. Carol, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you remember anything unusual about the time around Violet's birth? Anything that didn't quite make sense or that Mom and Dad asked you not to talk about? Carol's expression shifted immediately. She set down her coffee cup and looked around the cafe as if checking for eavesdroppers. Why are you asking me this now, Sophia? Because I think there are things about our family that aren't what they seem. And I think you've suspected it too. What she told me next confirmed my worst fears and gave me the final pieces I needed. Carol had always found it strange that Mom had been so secretive during the supposed pregnancy, refusing visitors and canceling family gatherings. She'd thought it was odd that there were no ultrasound photos, no baby shower, no excited preparation for a second child. Most damning of all, Carol revealed that she'd tried to visit Mom in the hospital after Violet's birth and had been told there were no visitors allowed due to complications. But when she'd called the hospital directly, they had no record of Margaret Winters being a patient during that time period. I always wondered, Carol admitted, but your parents seemed so happy, and Violet was such a beautiful baby. I figured maybe I'd mixed up dates or hospitals. But it nagged at me for years. As I drove home from that coffee meeting, I felt the final piece of my plan clicking into place. I wasn't just dealing with a hidden adoption anymore. I was dealing with a massive, family-wide deception that had been maintained through careful manipulation and strategic lies for nearly 3 decades. But now I had an ally who could corroborate my suspicions. And more importantly, I had someone else who was ready to start asking questions. The web of lies was about to unravel, and this time, I would be the one controlling how the truth came to light. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came in September, at Violet's engagement party, the second one. The first had been an intimate family affair that my parents had funded entirely. This was the big celebration for extended family and friends, held at an upscale country club with over 100 guests. I arrived early, as expected, to help with setup while Violet got ready at a nearby salon. The irony wasn't lost on me, even at her own party. I was the one doing the work while she was being pampered. But today, that dynamic would finally shift. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. Hidden in my purse was a manila envelope containing copies of all the adoption documents I'd found, along with a timeline I'd meticulously constructed showing the discrepancies in my parents' story. But the real weapon wasn't the documents themselves, it was the letter I'd written to Violet. As guests began arriving, I watched my parents transform into their public personas. Dad became the proud father, regaling anyone who'd listen with stories about his miracle daughter and her achievements. Mom played the devoted mother, sharing intimate details about Violet's childhood that painted her as naturally gifted and destined for greatness. Aunt Carol arrived with her family, giving me a meaningful look across the crowded room. Over the past month, she'd become my secret ally, helping me verify details and timelines. She'd also started asking her own careful questions within the family, gathering intelligence that confirmed what I'd suspected. Several relatives had harbored private doubts about the official story over the years. Violet made her grand entrance at exactly 7:30, perfectly timed for maximum impact. She looked stunning in a flowing emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair that supposedly came from Dad's Irish grandmother, according to the family mythology. Marcus followed behind her, beaming with pride and completely oblivious to the storm about to break. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to the usual script. Violet graciously accepted congratulations and gifts while my parents basked in reflected glory. I played my designated role as the helpful older sister, ensuring drinks were refreshed and guests were comfortable, practically invisible despite doing all the actual work. But as the evening progressed, I began positioning myself strategically. During Dad's toast to the happy couple, I made sure I was standing near the microphone. When Mom started telling the table of elderly relatives about Violet's childhood, I was close enough to interject with clarifying questions that highlighted inconsistencies. The turning point came when Great Aunt Helen, Mom's 90-year-old aunt who had a reputation for speaking her mind, made an observation that created the perfect opening. "You know, Margaret," Helen said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "I was just thinking about when Violet was born. Wasn't that around the time you were having all those health problems? I remember Ruth calling me, saying you were in and out of the hospital for months." The color drained from Mom's face. "Oh, that was different health issues, Aunt Helen. Nothing related to the pregnancy." But Helen wasn't finished. "Funny thing about memory at my age, some things get fuzzy, but others become crystal clear. I specifically remember Ruth saying you'd had that surgery, the one that meant you couldn't have more children. She was so sad about it because she knew how much you wanted to give Sophia a sibling." The conversation around us gradually quieted as people sensed tension. Dad jumped in quickly, trying to redirect. "Well, you know how medical situations can be complicated, Helen. The important thing is that everything worked out perfectly. That's when I made my move." "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room, "I think there might be some confusion about the timeline." "Aunt Helen, could you be more specific about when exactly you remember Aunt Ruth calling you about Mom's surgery?" Helen looked confused by my question, but she was never one to back down from a conversation. "Oh, that was definitely the fall before Violet appeared. I remember because it was right around Thanksgiving, and Ruth was so upset about Margaret's situation. Said the doctors had told her there was no possibility of natural pregnancy after that type of surgery." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Mom and Dad exchanging panicked glances, trying to figure out how to explain away this contradiction. But I wasn't done yet. "That's interesting," I continued, pulling the manila envelope from my purse. "Because I have some documents here that might help clarify the timeline for everyone." "Sophia," Dad's voice carried a warning tone, "this isn't the time or place." "Actually, Dad, I think this is exactly the time and place. Because this family has been living with confusion about our history for almost 30 years, and I think it's time everyone knew the truth." I opened the envelope and pulled out the letter I'd written to Violet. My hands were steady despite my racing heart. "Violet, before I share what I've discovered with everyone else, I wanted to give you the chance to read this first. Because unlike our parents, I believe you deserve to know the truth about where you came from." Violet looked around the room at the sea of expectant faces, then back at the letter in my hand. What are you talking about, Sophia? What truth? I handed her the letter. Why don't you read it out loud? I think everyone here deserves to hear what I found in Mom and Dad's attic 3 months ago. Violet unfolded the letter with shaking hands. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and I watched her face transform from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. You're joking, she whispered, but her voice carried across the silent room. Read it, I said gently but firmly. Let everyone hear what our parents never planned to tell you. With a trembling voice, Violet began reading the letter that would change everything. Dear Violet, I'm writing this because I discovered something about our family that changes everything we thought we knew. 3 months ago, I found adoption papers with your name on them, hidden in our parents' attic. As she read, revealing the documented evidence of her adoption, the timeline discrepancies, and the elaborate deception our parents had maintained, the room erupted in shocked murmurs. But the most devastating moment came when she reached the final paragraph. The saddest part isn't that you were adopted, Violet. It's that our parents loved you so much they rewrote history to make you perfect, while treating their biological daughter like she was never enough. But maybe now we can finally build a relationship based on truth instead of lies. When Violet finished reading, she looked directly at our parents, who were standing frozen by the gift table. Is this true? She asked, her voice breaking. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Mom whispered, we can explain. Is it true? Violet's voice was louder now, commanding. Dad's shoulders sagged in defeat. Yes. But, sweetheart, you have to understand. But Violet wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of gratitude, horror, and something that might have been respect. You're joking, she said again, but this time it wasn't disbelief. It was the sound of someone's entire world reshaping itself in real time. And in that moment, I knew the carefully constructed house of cards had finally collapsed. The country club's elegant ballroom had transformed into a battlefield of whispered conversations and shocked stares. Violet stood frozen in the center of it all, still clutching my letter, while our parents looked like deer caught in headlights. The engagement party had become something else entirely, a reckoning 30 years in the making. Marcus was the first to break the stunned silence. Violet, honey, what's going on? What does this mean? His confusion was genuine and heartbreaking. Unlike everyone else in the room, he had no context for the family dynamics at play. Violet couldn't seem to form words. She kept looking back and forth between the letter and our parents, as if trying to reconcile the people she'd known her entire life with the strangers who had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. Great Aunt Helen, bless her, had no filter for social situations. Well, I'll be damned. I knew something wasn't right about that story. Ruth, didn't I tell you at the time that the timeline didn't make sense? Aunt Ruth, Carol's twin, looked mortified. Helen, please. This is hardly the time. The hell it isn't. Helen's voice carried across the room. These people have been lying to all of us for decades, making us complicit in their fiction. I don't appreciate being made a fool of. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. It wasn't meant to hurt anyone. We just wanted to protect Violet, to give her the best possible start in life without the stigma. Protect her from what? I interrupted, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. From knowing she was chosen and wanted so desperately that you went through months of paperwork and background checks to bring her home? From understanding that you loved her enough to move heaven and earth to make her your daughter? Mom stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Sophia, you don't understand. We were trying to protect both of you. We thought if Violet grew up knowing she was adopted, she might feel different, less secure. And we thought if you knew we'd chosen to adopt after having you naturally, you might feel like I wasn't enough. I finished for her. Like you needed to go shopping for a better daughter because the one you had was defective. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Several guests gasped audibly, and I saw Aunt Carol cover her mouth with her hands. Violet finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You chose me? You specifically picked me out. Dad's face crumpled. Sweetheart, it wasn't like that. We didn't pick you instead of loving Sophia. We. Then why? Violet's voice was getting stronger, angrier. Why did you lie? Why did you make up an entire fake pregnancy story? Why did you let me believe I was your biological miracle baby while treating Sophia like she was? She trailed off, but we all knew what she meant to say. Like, she was nothing special. The room had divided into clusters of family members having urgent whispered conversations. Some were defending my parents, insisting they'd done what they thought was best. Others were expressing outrage at being deceived for so long. But the majority seemed simply stunned, trying to process the implications of what they'd learned. Marcus put his arm around Violet's shoulders, but she shrugged him off. I need air. I need to think. She looked directly at me for the first time since reading the letter. How long have you known? 3 months. And you've been planning this? This public humiliation. Her words stung, but I'd prepared for this reaction. I've been planning to tell the truth. The setting wasn't really up to me. Great Aunt Helen's memory chose the timing. Violet laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Do you realize what you've done? Do you understand that you've destroyed everything? My entire sense of self, my relationship with our parents, my understanding of my own history, all gone. Was your revenge really worth all that? The accusation hit harder than I'd expected. Looking at Violet's tear-stained face, seeing the genuine anguish in her eyes, I felt a moment of doubt about my methods. But then I remembered 28 years of being made to feel invisible, of watching my parents bend over backward for a child they'd chosen while taking their biological daughter for granted. This wasn't revenge, I said quietly. This was justice. And maybe it was the only way to finally have an honest relationship with you. Before Violet could respond, Uncle Frank, Dad's older brother, stepped into the center of our family drama. All right, that's enough. Richard, Margaret, I think you owe everyone here an explanation. The real story, not another version of your fairy tale. What followed was the most painful 30 minutes of family confession I'd ever witnessed. Under pressure from multiple relatives who felt betrayed by the deception, my parents finally told the complete truth. They revealed how they'd struggled with secondary infertility after my birth, how the diagnosis of Mom's condition had devastated them, and how they'd ultimately decided to pursue adoption. They explained the private agency, the careful selection process, and their decision to create a false narrative around Violet's origin to avoid what they saw as potential complications. But as they talked, something became clear that I hadn't fully understood before. Their deception hadn't just been about protecting Violet, it had been about protecting themselves. They'd created a story that made them the heroes of a heartwarming narrative about persistence and miracles, rather than a family who had made a practical decision to adopt. We thought we were doing the right thing, Mom sobbed. We thought if everyone believed Violet was our biological daughter, she'd never have to deal with questions about her birth parents or feeling different from Sophia. So instead, Aunt Carol said, her voice sharp with anger, you made Sophia feel different. You made her feel like she wasn't special enough, while building Violet's entire identity on a lie. The truth of Carol's words seemed to hit my parents like a physical blow. For the first time, they appeared to understand the full scope of what their deception had cost, not just in terms of honesty, but in terms of the damage done to both their daughters. Violet, who had been silent during their confession, suddenly turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The letter you wrote, you said maybe now we could build a relationship based on truth instead of lies. Did you mean that? I looked at my sister, because regardless of biology, that's what she was, standing in the ruins of her engagement party, her entire worldview shattered, and felt something shift inside me. Yes, I said simply. I meant every word. The party was over, obviously. Guests began leaving in small groups, some stopping to express support or concern, others simply fleeing the family drama. Marcus stayed close to Violet, clearly trying to process what this revelation meant for their relationship. My parents stood together, but somehow seemed completely alone, the weight of their decades-long deception finally visible on their faces. As I watched our family fracture in real time, I wondered if I'd won or if we'd all just lost everything together. 6 months have passed since that explosive engagement party, and I'm sitting in Violet's new apartment. Yes, she moved out of the family home, helping her sort through adoption registry websites. The irony isn't lost on either of us that we're finally acting like real sisters now that we know we're not biologically related. The immediate aftermath was brutal for everyone involved. Violet called off the engagement party's momentum and postponed her wedding for 6 months to process everything she'd learned. Marcus, to his credit, stood by her through the identity crisis that followed, but their relationship needed recalibrating around truth instead of the fantasy family narrative he'd been sold. My parents went through what can only be described as a complete breakdown. Dad took early retirement, unable to face the questions and judgment from colleagues who'd heard about the family drama through the small-town gossip network. Mom started therapy, real therapy, not just the casual counseling she'd tried before, to address what her therapist apparently called decades of compartmentalized guilt. But the most surprising development was how Violet and I finally began building an authentic relationship. 3 weeks after the party, she showed up at my apartment with a bottle of wine and a simple question: "Can you help me understand what my childhood was really like for you?" That conversation lasted until sunrise and changed everything between us. For the first time, Violet truly listened as I described what it felt like to watch her receive unconditional love while earning conditional approval. And I finally understood the pressure she'd felt to be perfect, to live up to the miraculous narrative our parents had built around her existence. "I always wondered why they seemed so anxious about me succeeding," she admitted. "Like my achievements were more important than normal parent pride. Now I realize they were trying to prove to themselves that they'd made the right choice in adopting me." We started meeting regularly, sharing stories and perspectives that had been impossible when we were locked into our assigned family roles. Violet told me about the subtle ways she'd always felt like she was performing her daughterhood, trying to live up to some invisible standard. I told her about the years I'd spent trying to figure out what was wrong with me that made me so much harder to love. The adoption search became our joint project. Using the documents I'd found and some detective work that would make Reddit investigators proud, we managed to track down information about Violet's birth parents. It turns out her biological mother had been a 17-year-old honor student who'd made the difficult decision to place her daughter with a family that could provide opportunities she couldn't offer. When Violet finally made contact, the conversation was emotional but healing. Her birth mother, now a successful nurse with a family of her own, had wondered about her daughter for 28 years. She was grateful to learn that Violet had been loved and given opportunities, but she was also honest about the pain of the closed adoption and how she'd always hoped for eventual contact. My parents' journey has been more complicated. The family therapy sessions we all attended were difficult but necessary. Dr. Martinez, our therapist, helped us understand how the initial deception had created a cascade of dysfunction that affected every family interaction for decades. The problem wasn't the adoption, Dr. Martinez explained during one particularly intense session. The problem was building your family identity around a fundamental dishonesty that required constant maintenance and created artificial hierarchies between your children. Mom's breakthrough came when she finally admitted that her preference for Violet hadn't been natural maternal instinct, it had been guilt. I was so terrified that we'd made a mistake, that Violet would somehow figure out she was adopted and reject us. So I overcompensated by trying to prove how much we loved her, how right our choice had been. But what about Sophia? Dr. Martinez pressed. How did that overcompensation affect your relationship with your biological daughter? The silence that followed was deafening until Dad finally spoke. We took Sophia for granted. We assumed that because she was our biological child, our love for her was secure, permanent. We thought we didn't need to prove anything with her. It was the first time either parent had acknowledged the fundamental injustice of how they'd treated us differently. The apology that followed was years overdue but genuinely felt. Recovery hasn't been linear or simple. There are still family dinners that turn awkward when someone mentions the past. Mom still sometimes slips into treating Violet as more fragile than me. Dad still struggles with guilt about the financial disparities in how he supported us over the years. But there have been victories too. Last month, my parents helped me with a down payment on my own house, something they'd never offered before. When I expressed surprise, Dad said quietly, "We have 28 years of missed opportunities to make up for, Sophia. This is just the beginning." Violet's wedding, when it finally happened, was different than originally planned. Instead of the fairy tale celebration my parents had envisioned, it became a genuine celebration of chosen family. Her birth mother attended, along with our extended family, who had rallied around truth over comfortable fiction. Violet asked me to be her maid of honor, and her speech at the reception brought the house down. "They say you can't choose your family," she said, looking directly at me, "but that's not true. My parents chose me, and I'm grateful. But more importantly, my sister chose to tell me the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. And I'm choosing all of you, biological, adopted, and everything in between, as my family going forward." The most healing moment came during the mother-daughter dance. Instead of the traditional single dance, Violet insisted on sharing the song between our mom and her birth mother. Watching the three of them navigate that symbolic moment with grace and mutual respect felt like witnessing a small miracle of human forgiveness. These days, family relationships are more honest, but also more work. We all had to learn how to love each other based on who we actually are rather than the roles we'd been assigned. It's messier than the perfect family narrative my parents had constructed, but it's real. I've also discovered something unexpected about myself through this process. The years of feeling overlooked taught me resilience and independence that serve me well now. The ability to observe family dynamics objectively helped me navigate the revelation and aftermath with clarity rather than pure emotion. In some ways, being the less favored child prepared me to handle difficult truths that might have destroyed someone who'd never faced adversity. Violet and I often joke that we got the sisters we needed rather than the ones we were born to be. She needed someone who would tell her hard truths and challenge her to grow beyond the protected bubble our parents created. I needed someone who would finally see and appreciate the strength I'd developed in the shadows. The extended family has mostly rallied around our new normal, though there are still relatives who think I was wrong to expose the truth so publicly. Great Aunt Helen, predictably, has become one of my biggest supporters. "Honesty is like exercise," she told me recently. "It's painful at first, but it makes everything stronger in the long run." As I finish helping Violet prepare for her first meeting with a half-sister her birth mother had mentioned, I'm struck by how different our relationship is now. We're both more ourselves, she's less perfect, I'm less invisible, and somehow that makes us better siblings than we ever were when we were trying to fit into the roles our parents had created. Looking back, I don't regret exposing the truth, even though the methods were dramatic and painful for everyone involved. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about clearing the air so that real relationships can finally take root. So here's what I want to know from all of you watching. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew about your relationships? How did you handle learning that the people you trusted most had been living a lie? And for those of you who've chosen to speak truth in situations where silence would have been easier, do you think the pain of honesty is worth it for the healing that can come after? Drop your stories in the comments below because I've learned that families are complicated everywhere, and sometimes the most helpful thing is knowing you're not alone in navigating the messy realities of love, loyalty, and truth. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real talk about family dynamics, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's possible to rebuild relationships on a foundation of honesty, even when the truth is painful. Thanks for taking this journey with me, and remember, sometimes the family that chooses to tell you the truth is more valuable than the family that chooses to protect you from it. Until next time, keep questioning the narratives that don't quite add up, because the truth might set everyone free.